Good evening. Thanks for joining us this hour. Happy to have you with us. So we've been on the road. We sent producers out across the country to pull together a really important story tonight about something that is happening right now with historic implications. The story here tonight begins with this guy. This is Harry Blackmun. He was from Minnesota, a conservative lawyer, a judge first appointed to the federal bench by Dwight Eisenhower. He became Richard Nixon's second appointment to the United States Supreme Court. But Blackmun was not Nixon's first choice for the job. Nixon's first two picks had pro-segregation records that got unearthed or dissected during the confirmation process. Both of them were ultimately rejected by the Senate, which was a big and embarrassing blow for Nixon. So for his third try, Nixon chose Harry Blackmun because Blackmun was seen as so uncontroversial that he would be hard for anybody to vote against.
Judge Blackmun made a good first impression on the senators who will help decide his fate, and barring the unexpected, his nomination should sail through. Thus far, no one has even asked to testify against him. But the unexpected already has occurred twice, so most senators still are not committing themselves.
The find a super uncontroversial guy strategy worked for that nomination. Harry Blackmun's nomination to the court was unanimously approved by the U.S. Senate. On June 9th, 1970, he was sworn into the Supreme Court. And somewhat ironically, for a guy who was chosen specifically because he was seen as the most middle-of-the-road, non-offensive, guaranteed, non-controversial guy to stick in that spot, Justice Blackmun would go on just a couple of years later to write one of the most controversial U.S. Supreme Court opinions ever.
The court said in a 7-2 decision that in the first 3 months of pregnancy, only the woman and her physician may decide whether she may have an abortion. In the second 3 months, all the state may do is regulate abortion procedures. And only in the final 3 months of pregnancy can the state forbid abortion. All 50 states are effective, whatever their laws.
It wasn't a close decision. It was decided by a big majority, right? 7-2. But it was Harry Blackmun who wrote the opinion for the 7-member majority. And for that reason, Harry Blackmun became the sort of face of that ruling, the face of Roe versus Wade. 5 years after his death, Justice Blackmun's papers were released. And that's when we, the public, learned that Harry Blackmun saved everything. Everything. In the 1,500 plus boxes of documents he donated to the Library of Congress. You can find everything from hotel receipts to tennis scores to dance cards from childhood, private notes between the justices and the Supreme Court. And it turns out when you are the guy who wrote the Roe versus Wade decision, and you are also a guy who keeps everything, that means you're a guy who has held on to a pile of hate mail and death wishes and threats. 10 years after Roe, in 1983, according to reporting by the Associated Press, the Supreme Court had received 45,000 letters about Roe versus Wade, most of them addressed to Justice Blackmun. Justice Blackmun said at the time, quote, "We still receive 8, 9, 10 letters a day. Some are very supportive, very lovely messages, but most are very abusive. The more recent ones are as abusive as the initial ones." Ignoring the advice of fellow justices against reading such mail, Justice Blackmun says, "I want to know what the people who wrote are thinking." Here's what they were thinking. Quote, "They have called him a murderer, a butcher, even Pontius Pilate. They have compared him to the Nazi overseers of genocide." In 1985, a bullet from a 9mm pistol was shot through Justice Blackmun's apartment window and into his living room, showering glass onto his wife, who happened to be in the room. It was never determined if that bullet was directly targeting Justice Blackmun or if it might have been a stray shot, just a coincidence. But the shot through the window came on the heels of a series of death threats. Justice Blackmun's daughter has said he always traveled with security after that.
Blackmun, who used to go alone on walks, has been under protection since receiving a letter last fall and another last week threatening him with death. Anti-abortion demonstrators have singled out Blackmun for his authorship of the court's 1973 decision decriminalizing abortion.
That's how the modern-day abortion wars have been fought in this country from day one, from the Roe versus Wade decision onward, with violence and the threat of violence always hanging in the air. When the Supreme Court cleared the way for legal abortion in every state, clinics sprang up all over the country to accommodate women who were coming out of the shadows to access this now legally protected procedure.
Okay, is there an appointment for an abortion?
But as quickly as abortion clinics opened their doors, organized opponents gathered trying to shut them down.
After the Supreme Court legalized abortion, an abortion clinic opened in St. Louis. Anti-abortion groups have been picketing ever since. They also got the legislature to throw up various roadblocks to abortion.
By the 1980s and 90s, this is what it was like to be an abortion provider in America.
Already, many have bulletproof glass, and across the country, there are more than 30,000 escorts who have to use cloak and dagger measures to protect doctors, clients, and themselves.
A wave of clinic bombings that peaked in the 1980s was followed by a series of assassinations in the 1990s.
An abortion facility was hit by a bomb blast.
Bomb blasts at 3 abortion clinics.
A propane gas bomb exploded last night in the Washington office of the National Abortion Federation. So far this year, 28 abortion clinics and information centers have been bombed or set afire.
Dr. David Gunn was shot after getting out of his car as he came to work at a Pensacola abortion clinic.
Dr. Tiller, who performs third trimester abortions, had been shot twice outside his clinic.
The gunman shot 4 people before escaping here. One woman, a clinic worker, died at the scene.
Dr. John Britton and James Barrett were cut down with shotgun blasts.
Barnett Slepian, an Amherst, New York doctor well known to anti-abortion protesters, was shot dead by a sniper last night while at home with his wife and 4 children.
You could not find an abortion provider in the 80s and 90s who would say they felt immune from the threat of terroristic violence. Everyone involved in abortion was vulnerable, but perhaps no one was targeted as relentlessly as one specific doctor in Wichita, Kansas, Dr. George Tiller.
For 2 months, anti-abortion protesters laid siege to clinics in Wichita, Kansas. But their main target was not the clinic. It was a doctor, Dr. George Tiller. They called him Tiller the Killer. Tiller still performs abortions, but hundreds of other doctors have stopped because of scenes like this and this.
Anti-abortion forces targeted Dr. Tiller in every way imaginable. In 1986, his clinic was bombed. Tiller hung a sign outside the bombed-out building that said, "Hell no, we won't go." He reopened the next day at a secret location.
We have had a major $100,000 bombing here in our organization, and 1 day later, we're in business.
In 1991, the radical anti-abortion group Operation Rescue called on thousands of anti-abortion activists from across the country to converge on Wichita to physically shut down George Tiller's clinic.
Wichita is not used to guerrilla tactics, but it's learning. People here have seen weeks of militant anti-abortion protests, barricading clinics, harassing patients, using children as human shields.
Eventually, the radical fringe of the anti-abortion movement turned to a chilling new tactic to isolate and target doctors. Wanted posters that cast abortion doctors as murderers and gave anyone who might wish them harm literal instructions on how to find those doctors. There was a wanted poster targeting Dr. David Gunn before he was murdered. It showed his photo, the make and model and license plate number on his car. It showed the addresses of each of his offices. There was a wanted poster targeting Dr. John Britton before he was murdered. The photo even shows him wearing a bulletproof vest. It lists information about his car and includes his home address. Here's a wanted poster of Dr. George Tiller that we believe circulated in the early 90s. It compares him to Adolf Hitler. It shows his photo, the city where he lives, and his exact office address. On August 19, 1993, an anti-abortion activist named Shelley Shannon walked up to Dr. George Tiller at the parking lot of the address on that poster, and she shot him.
For the second time this year, an abortion doctor has been shot, apparently by an anti-abortion activist. This time, the doctor survived the attack.
Dr. Tiller was taken to the hospital and treated. He returned to his clinic to work the next day.
You know, I'm just like my patients. You know, last night I got shot and I was scared, but there was somebody there to take care of me.
Shelley Shannon shooting him did not stop Dr. George Tiller.
What did you want to do when you shot him?
Stop him from killing babies.
But getting caught and convicted and sentenced and thrown in prison did not stop Shelley Shannon from believing that she did the right thing, and that she was and could continue to be an important part of a movement that embraces violence as a means to end abortion in America. There is a pro-violence wing of the anti-abortion movement. These people see themselves as soldiers in an actual war. They call themselves the Army of God. Assassinating abortion doctors, in their view, is justifiable homicide. Going to jail for murdering an abortion doctor is seen as a noble sacrifice. Before she shot Dr. Tiller, Shelley Shannon wrote warm, approving letters to the man who killed Dr. David Gunn in Florida. She wrote to him in jail as he awaited trial. When she went on to commit her own act of violence, that began the next chapter of her life as a hero soldier in the Army of God. Her prison term would stop her from personally carrying out any further violence, but it couldn't stop her from inspiring the next would-be assassin. Meanwhile, in Wichita, Dr. Tiller kept on with his work.
You simply cannot retreat when you're committed. There is no way that we are going to be forced out of this particular moral, correct, legal healthcare experience.
Outside of the Army of God manifestos from dark corners of the internet, some of the most radical language used against George Tiller was piped into millions of homes on a regular basis, thanks to a television host on the Fox News channel.
Killing babies in America. That's the subject of this evening's Talking Points memo. For $5,000, Tiller, the baby killer as some call him, will perform a late-term abortion for just about any reason. This man, Dr. George Tiller, known as Tiller, the baby killer, is performing late-term abortions without defining the specific medical reasons why.
In 2002, an anti-abortion state legislator named Phil Klein was elected Attorney General for the state of Kansas.
I want to first tell you who does not endorse Attorney General Phil Klein. Abortionist Dr. George Tiller does not endorse Phil Klein.
In 2011, a producer from this show asked for his thoughts on abortion.
Mr. Klein, do you yourself believe that abortion should be made illegal?
Do I myself? Yes.
Yes.
I just want to make one other comment about that. I'm also anti-murder, and I put a lot of murderers away, too. I followed the law.
Almost immediately upon taking office as Kansas State Attorney General, Phil Klein started a secret investigation into George Tiller. He used subpoena power to get dozens of patient medical records. In defiance of a judge's order keeping the patient's identity secret, Klein's staff staked out Dr. Tiller's parking lot. They followed patients. They took down license plate numbers. They subpoenaed a nearby hotel for records that helped them unredact these patients' medical records to get the patients' names. All of this was in pursuit of something to use against George Tiller, something to charge him with. But it also sent a message to women and girls in Kansas. If you try to get an abortion here, you could be the subject of an investigation by the state attorney general. This guy will get his hands on your personal medical records, all of them. Klein ultimately got his license to practice law yanked by the state of Kansas for misconduct in his pursuit of Dr. Tiller. All of his efforts against Tiller ultimately yielded a misdemeanor case brought by Klein's successor over how Tiller referred patients for a state-mandated second opinion in certain abortions. On March 27, 2009, following years of investigations, after 4 days of testimony, it took jurors all of 45 minutes to clear George Tiller of all charges. But 2 months later, Dr. Tiller was dead. Tiller's murderer had been sitting in that courtroom, watching that trial, watching the justice system exonerate George Tiller. You can see him here, sitting next to the president of Operation Rescue. 2 months later, he would walk into the church George Tiller attended. He walked in on a Sunday morning, he held up a gun to Tiller's head, and he executed him at point-blank range. According to the killer, Scott Roeder, he'd been thinking about killing George Tiller for years. But it was the result of that trial, George Tiller's acquittal of all those misdemeanor charges, that motivated him to actually go through with it, to actually do it.
It seemed like that was the last attempt by the state of Kansas to find if there was anything at all going on illegally in George Tiller's clinic. And it seemed as though that was the last step, and now he was acquitted, found not guilty.
Did you decide that it was incumbent upon you to do something?
There was nothing being done, and the legal process had been exhausted, and these babies were dying every day. And I felt that if someone did not do something, he was going to continue aborting children. And so I felt that I needed to act, and quickly, for those children.
Scott Roeder did not get to this point of radicalization overnight. According to his ex-wife, he'd become involved in the anti-abortion movement in the 1990s. He'd protested at clinics, including Dr. Tiller's. He'd tried to superglue the lock shut on another Kansas clinic. He'd also visited Shelley Shannon in prison.
Get down on your knees!
On the day he murdered Dr. Tiller, when he was arrested that day after the shooting, a scrap of paper was found in his getaway car. On that scrap of paper was written the phone number of a top Operation Rescue official. Roeder testified at his murder trial that he learned about Dr. Tiller's security protocols from Operation Rescue. Scott Roeder, the murderer of Dr. George Tiller, was not a lone wolf. He was the product of a violent, radical anti-abortion network.
Look, when I was in the pro-life movement, we knew who was gluing doors shut. We knew who was vandalizing property. We knew of people who had thrown firebombs. We knew, of course, people who were in jail. Most of these pro-life groups have a group of people, always on the fringe, who are hanging around, more extreme than others, who they know have been involved in acts of vandalism, petty theft, maybe a firebombing, this or that. It's time to begin to blow the whistle on these guys. Had that happened with Scott Roeder, Dr. Tiller would not have been murdered.
When he was tried for the murder of Dr. Tiller, it took a jury all of 37 minutes to decide that they would convict Scott Roeder. And with that, the trial was over. The national media attention faded, and Wichita was left to grapple with the aftermath of this act of terrorism. Without George Tiller, there was no abortion provider left in this city. And that might have been it. But Tiller's friends and family and supporters decided that they would do what they had seen George Tiller do time and again. They would overcome the fear and the intimidation and the violence and come back.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.